really excited to be able to have Augie Ghilarducci with us here and to introduce him. You just heard from him, Sheriff Ron Hain from Kane County, Illinois. Ron, over to you.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate that. And I just have to circle back and say, in listening to the first half hour, 45 minutes of this call, I couldn't be more impressed with what California has done and what they've accomplished. In this initiative, you guys are light years, sorry, HMA to say this out loud, light years above and beyond where we are in Illinois. And we're still playing tug of war with so many other counties here to get them up to speed and where they'd like to be and where we'd like to see them. But the data you guys are throwing out there and the planning that you have, the data you have to back all that up, just congrats. Beautiful stuff. So when I took over as sheriff in 2018 here in Kane County, we had little to no programming inside of our jail. We're talking maybe a couple AA groups and religious groups going on. But as far as really foundational supportive and reentry programming, there was none. So our whole concept was not just besides recovery pod and medically assisted treatment, which is so essential to our success, but programming that gives people real vocational foundation. People will receive an actual warm handoff out into the community. People will not recidivize, and we will know that they will succeed, not just guess that they will as we push them out the door. And what I tell everybody in these groups is my sole motivation in this, despite, live a great life, be productive, go back to your family, but don't ever come back to my jail because we have so many opportunities for you to be successful. So one of the first people who approached me was Augie Ghilarducci, and I'm so glad that Bren said his name earlier because Augie, even though he's a dear friend of mine, I still continuously murder his last name. So that's why I just refer to him as Augie. But Augie was one of our first classes. His second opportunities presentation and course is out of this world. And we do survey all of our detainees after courses. And this is the one that consistently came back every single time as being essential to the success of our reentering population. So what really sold it home for me is not just being able to witness a class on some occasions, but the fact that Augie has a true connection with the detainees. And I'm not going to spoil his presentation here to talk about his background, but it'll hit you when you hear it. And when I'm listening to these classes and Augie is sitting there giving out his cell phone number and guys who are able to make phone calls out of our facility are talking about, hey, Augie, when I called you the other night, or hey, Augie, I'm going to call you when I get out. He answers the phone. He's there for everybody. And of course, this is how people, as they go through that tough transition from years, sometimes in custody, back out to the streets with very little support, to have that person to pick up and call and be there for them at any time. Augie's that man. So I can't thank him enough for all he's done to drive down our recidivism here in Kane County, to support our marginalized communities. And I can't say much more without really giving up Augie's full talk here. So Augie, I'm going to kick it to you, my brother. And I'm so happy to see you presenting to this great group in California. Well deserved.
Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate that. And I always appreciate when you're involved in something, and you were kind enough to introduce me to HMA. So now I'm involved in this group, and I'm glad to be here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Augie Ghilarducci, and I gave a presentation for HMA in Illinois, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and I started by saying that I've never told this story in public before. And we were in person, so I was standing in front of the room, and I noticed how many heads actually turned, like it was going to be some deep, dark confession or something. But so this is now the second time they've told this story, and I make light of it, but it really does stir up feelings in me like very few other things do. It's a nightmare that I have even after all these years. I was a self-surrender to prison, and that's a situation where the judge tells you what you're sentenced to, and then you receive a letter in the mail from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and they give you the name and address and date and time you're supposed to report. So my wife dropped me off at a place called Sandstone, Minnesota. And I remember the ride vividly. I remember the night before laying in bed, tossing and turning. I remember that when we pulled up at the time, this is now 15, 18 years ago, whatever it is. And I was a cigarette smoker. And I tried to make it like a scene from Goodfellas. You know, I threw my cigarette on the ground and said, now take me to jail. And really, that was just a defense mechanism. I was trying to appear strong and that everything was okay, but it was anything but okay. I was afraid, I was uncertain, I was lost. I was about to start serving a 190-month sentence in prison. Prior to that, I had never been in trouble in my life, with the exception of a couple of speeding tickets. And that's how they sentence you in federal court. They give you your sentence in months, so you've got to be a math whiz to figure out how long you're actually going to be locked up for. I remember walking inside, and they took my clothes and put everything in a box that they were going to send home. And they gave me the only pair of khaki pants they had, which was about a size 10X, which I'd need 3 of me to fit inside to keep them from falling down. And I sat chained to a bench, and all I thought about was how many people I had let down, my young children, what my life was going to become. I had no idea what was beyond the next door. And finally, they came to get me. They changed my hands to be cuffed behind my back. They walked me to a cell, and they opened the door and put me inside and took the cuffs off. And sitting on the bottom bunk was a younger guy, and he didn't have his shirt on it, and every inch of his body appeared to be covered by tattoos. And he looked like he had been lifting weights every day of his life. And he introduced himself to me, told me his name was John, and the anxiety I felt at that moment, it literally felt like my heart was going to pound out of my chest. The cell door is locked, and I want to be anywhere in the world but where I was at that time. And there was simply no leaving where I was. I wanted to be with my family. I wanted to talk to my family. I couldn't breathe. And John explained to me that at the moment I came in, and this was July 18th of 2005, at the moment that I came in, the prison was going through a food strike. And every bed in the prison was full, and I was going to sit in a place called The Hole for a while until a bed opened up. And The Hole is the jail inside the prison. It's where where you're being disciplined for things you do in the prison. So they're small cells. They're probably, I don't know, 6 by 10. There's a toilet right next to the bunk bed. There's no window. There's a door that has a flap that drops down from the outside, and that's how they pass the food trays in and out. And anytime you're going to leave there, you put your hands behind you and slide them out. That's flap so they can take the handcuffs off. Anyway, I spent about 4 days in there, and at many points I thought I was losing my mind, truly. I couldn't reconcile what I had done, how I had destroyed my life, and I did not see where tomorrow was going to come from. I'm also would say that I was thinking, if I can't make it through a day, how in the world am I going to make it through 15 years? And that was some of the things that were going on in my life. Every good thought that I tried to have turned to anxiety and guilt. My wife, as I said, had dropped me off. She had an 8-hour drive back to Chicago. I wanted to call, make sure she got there safely. My children, I promised them that I would call them and let them know that I was okay. My mom, I knew would be waiting for a call from me. And it took me actually 10 days before I could get to a telephone to make a call to talk to my family and let them hear my voice. I knew they'd be worried sick about me. So I got out of the hole, and I'm escorted to this unit. It's like dormitory style. And they had a row of many, many bunk beds with small lockers next to them, and it was called a trailer park. And it's where you waited until a cube that had a larger locker and a chair. And so I'm laying on the top bunk, and a guy walks up to me, and he introduced himself, and we were similar in age. And it ends up that we were from the same general part of the Chicagoland area. Actually knew a few people in common. And so he became a friend of mine. And one of the cool things was, at that point, he had been locked up 16 years. And I spent time with him as I was getting settled in, and he gave me some advice about how to survive prison. And one of the things he told me is, stay out of the TV rooms. Nothing good happens in there. And I took that advice and I found it to be true. And that's a lot of how I did my time. But anyway, I'm laying there minding my own business, and somebody comes up and says, "Hey, new guy, there's somebody at the door for you." And I'm thinking, who in the world would be here to see me? Who even knows that I'm here? And I walk downstairs to the front doorway and I walk out, and there's a guy standing there, and he said, "Are you Augie?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, he shook my hand. He said, "These are from John." And in my hand, he put like 4 cigarettes. And John was still in the hole because he was in there on disciplinary stuff. And so somehow he got word out, and this guy came and found me and gave me some cigarettes. And he said, "John wants me to take care of you. There's no cost. He's not charging you. He wants you to have these. Don't worry about it. Here's where I live. If you need any more, just come and see me." And I told him I couldn't do it because I hadn't smoked now for 4 or 5 days, and I didn't want to break that. But really on the inside, I knew I could, if I caught with cigarettes, I'd be in trouble, and I was already in more trouble than I could possibly handle. But in some ways, and I understand in the good work that you're doing, and I get all that, and I'm going to talk about reentry in general, but in some ways that story tells everything there is to know about incarceration. That is that we don't have to go looking for trouble. Trouble can come looking for us. And trouble's not just somebody handing us a few cigarettes or involving us in a football ticket where we're gambling or any of those other things that break rules of the prison. But trouble is getting into a place, a negative place mentally that makes it hard to recover. It's giving up on ourselves. It's that feeling of hopelessness. I spent most of my time working in the education department, and I go up to teach classes after dinner, and there was this road that you walk down inside the prison, but there's a road going to the education building, and I'd walk that road, and this was in Minnesota, so in the wintertime it was incredibly cold, and I'd be thinking to myself, this is never going to end. I mean, this is just what I'm going to do for the rest of my existence, is just go through these motions to try to get done with this. And on the inside, they call it being shot out. I think a more appropriate term is that we become institutionalized. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we get released. And I tell the story that when I was first to the halfway house, they took a van of us, there were probably 6 or 8, they took a van of us to a Target store downtown Chicago. And I walked inside. I hadn't been in the store. At that point, I hadn't been in the store in almost 13 years. And I wanted to get some deodorant and a couple other things. And I walked into the deodorant aisle. And when I got deodorant while I was away, you get a commissary piece of paper, and you had 2 choices, deodorant or antiperspirant. That's it. And now there's literally 100 choices in front of me. It was overwhelming. It was overwhelming to see what things cost. It was overwhelming to see how fast the world was moving. And I'll talk in a minute about technology. So the reality of reentry is it's an entire process. And the title of this talk is It Begins in Jail. And it really does begin in jail, because it's that first night, those first couple of nights, where we're going through this internal battle about how did I do this? How did I get myself here? We're so angry with ourselves, and we're saying, I never want this to happen again. But if there's no alternative path, somehow trouble in some form or fashion will find us. So I'm grateful to be here. I thank Bren and Kelly and Amanda and Rich for inviting me to do this. It's a little different doing it in front of a computer screen than in person. But I'll do the best I can with it. I'm going to share some thoughts about trauma, the effects of incarceration, and some solutions I think that contribute to reducing recidivism. I don't have all the answers, but I think I have a few ideas that seem to make sense and seem to be working for us. I'll just share with you that I come from a loving middle-class home. There were 2 parents. There was my sister and I, and we were given every opportunity to get an education. And after graduation, I went to work in the financial services firm, and I was 25 or 26 years old. And I decided I wanted to open my own company. So I opened a financial planning and business consulting firm. And for 15 years, I would have called myself successful. At one point, I had more than 40 employees. I had a nice house, and we took vacations, and my kids were able to play on sports teams and go to school. And I was a regular guy. And at some point, I got involved with the wrong people. It's been more than 25 years since my crime was actually committed. That was 1996. And I still can't believe how I allowed myself to make such bad decisions, use such poor judgment, be so greedy and so selfish. And that's something that's with me every day. I was prosecuted and convicted, and I was sentenced to 15 years, 10 months. I got pretty good at sentencing math. And I ended up serving 13 years out of it. But reentry is a jigsaw puzzle. There is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that makes it okay. We all have different things, right? There's some people that they have certain pieces in place that they can count on, and there's others. I mean, these are for me, having been there, they're heartbreaking stories. The men that never went to the telephone room because there's nobody that would answer their calls. The men that would talk about the visiting room like it's some sort of paradise because they never went there because nobody ever came to see them. And those are some of the realities that we're surrounded by. And so the jigsaw puzzle of reentry is to say that, since there's no one size fits all, and there's no one answer for any of this. We know things that work. We know things that are evidence-based or evidence-informed that tell us, look, if people will do these certain things, the chances are more likely. But there's nothing that says if people do these certain things, the chances are absolute. I mean, the recidivism rates in this country are ridiculously high. It's like, they call it warehousing human beings. And, I have a person I work with. He's the executive director of Second Opportunity, and he doesn't have any prison background. But he says, it's kind of like his daughter goes to college, and he pays for her 4 years, and she gets a degree and comes out and says, Dad, what I went to school for, I don't think I like that anymore. I want to go back to college. And he pays again for 4 years, and she comes out again, and she said, Dad, and he says, at some point, I got to say, why are we spending this money if we can't correct this? And that's kind of what the prison thing is that we spend all this money incarcerating people, but we don't have the solutions that might be out there. So I talk about 3 categories of inmates. To be clear, I was locked up with thousands of guys over the years, thousands. And there's the, the top, if I make it an egg-shaped thing, the top maybe 5 or 10%, they don't need anything for reentry. Maybe they have a really short sentence, and when they get out, their credit card bill is still waiting for them. Maybe they come from family wealth. Maybe they don't have any problems financially, whatever it might be. And then sadly, there's the bottom part that might be 20, 30%. I really don't know a number, but there are unfortunately people that just can't follow rules. If they walk into a room and there's a sign by a light switch that says, do not touch this switch, the first thing they'll do is touch the switch. And I don't write people off. I mean, my business is not writing people off. My passion is not writing people off, but the likelihood is that they will, for whatever reason, they'll be drawn to doing things that create problems for them. And unfortunately, that's the reason that the beds in jails and prisons will always be occupied. But there's the category in the middle, and that's the majority. It's people that made a mistake. It's people that have done things that they don't want to repeat. They've done things that they regret. It may be things that they've done due to their addictions. Certainly there's mental illness that's throughout prisons, and people aren't in their sound mind when they make the decisions they make that gets them incarcerated. But those are the people that are really just crying for some help for reentry. And I've seen the revolving door recidivism. I've lived it. And what I'll say is this, that I used to watch men leave, say their goodbyes, and then months later, 6 months later, a year later, maybe 2 years later, they come back. And in the beginning, I'm ashamed to say, in the beginning, I was upset with them. I'm thinking, you got your chance and you blew it. And now you're back here. And, I'm waiting for my chance, and I got a long wait ahead of me. But when I came to open my mind, I realized that they really didn't stand a chance. that they didn't have any stable housing to go to. They had addiction issues. They didn't have any current skills for the job marketplace. They maybe had limited education. Maybe the trauma that they endured was overwhelming to them, and it was too difficult to fit in. The county jails have, two basic populations. They have the short termers, right? They're going to bond out, or their charges are going to be dropped. Maybe they prevail at trial, or they have short sentences that they'll serve and then be released in fairly short order. That's certainly a part of the population, but there's also a population in jail that are just waiting to be sentenced and sent off to the State Department of Corrections or sent off to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And they could be going away for decades as they sit in county jail. And so inside county jail is where I think things can happen in order to change the trajectory by making aware of different things that can be done. I share some of the things that shaped my journey, that made me so passionate about the work that I do, the things that made me so observant and understanding some of what was going on around me, and trying to prepare and share with others ways to prepare for and to re-enter and deal with and understand the barriers and challenges that face us. Within the first 6 months of my incarceration, my mother was diagnosed with and died of pancreatic cancer. That was kind of a welcome to the understanding that nobody really cared. And then 3 months later, I spent about a month in the hole under investigation. And that's the time that I finally woke up, accepted responsibility for my bad behavior, and rediscovered my faith. I worked in the education department, which taught me that people learn differently. As I was developing and teaching courses, it was not about read this book and write a report. It was more about let's talk about this concept and have some good discussion and dialogue, and that seemed to work. I was in a community outreach program for 9 years. And for 9 years, I went into high schools and colleges and businesses and leadership groups, and I shared the mistakes that I made from an ethical perspective to help employers and employees and students understand that sometimes we find ourselves in a difficult situation where we've got to make a decision. And sometimes if we're unsure of our decision, we need to seek counsel people that care about us, counsel people to be honest with us and say, hey, that's a really bad decision. Because had I taken the time to share with my father the things I was getting into, I'm quite certain the conversation would have ended with me realizing that I was going down the wrong path. But what I did is I built a silo around myself and decided that it was probably a good idea for me to do it, and it ended very badly. I was the clerk for 5 years in the federal drug program called RDAP. So I lived in the RDAP dorm, and that was where I learned about CBT and rational thinking. I dealt with men that had battled substance abuse addiction for years. In Minnesota, there was a lot of guys that were in there for manufacturing and selling methamphetamine. So to be very candid with you, at the time I went away, I didn't even know what meth was. And then as I learned about it and guys would share their stories about it, to me, I was overwhelmed with all they had gone through and frankly, how the addiction drove them to do some really, really bad things. Through the change in medication while I was away, I suffered a head injury, and I dealt for 4 or 5 years with post-concussion syndrome. And that's why whenever I talk, I have notes, because I can forget things pretty easily. Less than 3 years from coming home, my father died of a stroke. And I understand what it's like to re-enter. I understand rejection from family, from friends, or people I thought were my friends upon re-entry. I say jokingly that while I was away, I caught a case of social anxiety. It's not a problem I'd ever had in my life. But now I can stand in front of a room of 500 people and talk about this kind of stuff, but put me in a room with 6 to 8 people in a social setting, and I will be glued to the wall and absolutely the last person to speak. And that's something that's come out of what I've gone through. technology, when I was picked up by my wife to go to the halfway house and I get in her car, she's fooling around with her phone. I've never seen a smartphone. And she hands it to me and I look and it's some friends of ours that are on FaceTime talking to me. And it was like being in an episode of the Jetsons. I had no idea what technology was and how it had changed over all those years. So successful reentry is in part being prepared for challenges, understanding what those challenges might be, and being able to process and develop different strategies. And in the drug program, they used to call it exit strategies, but it's having things in place to be able to cope with what may happen and not let us go back to some of the behaviors that led to the incarceration in the first place. There's a book that I read this summer called How to Change by a woman called Katie Milkman. And she talks about, we want to start with a blank slate. And that's one of the things that we deal with while we're incarcerated. I dealt with is anybody going to forgive me? Is anybody ever going to let me put this behind myself? And one of the things that we talk about as we work inside jails and prisons and halfway houses and recovery centers is, first thing that worked for me was taking responsibility for my actions. I screwed up. I regret that I did. I'm sorry that I did, but it's mine. I own it. And the problem with that is that for me, once I owned it, I started every day hating myself. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have been so greedy? How could I put myself in the situation? How could I have left my children behind? And the reality was I had to work at it. And it took a couple of years that I could actually start to forgive myself. Forgive myself that I made a mistake, that I exhibited bad behavior, bad decisions, and to accept the fact that I have to get past this. Because if I can't, I'll be in prison. Regardless of where my body is, I'll be in prison for the rest of my life. And so one of the things that we talk about and we work on is to develop a plan. And the plan is to have a life that we'll think is going to be fulfilling upon release. And part of the plan is to say that, I want to be able to take care of my responsibilities. I want to be able to do the things that people do, go to work, pay my taxes, own a car, have a house or an apartment or whatever it might be. And I maintain in the conversations that I have with the incarcerated population, especially that not the silver bullet, but certainly an important part of it is to advance either our skills or our education. And while we're incarcerated, we have every opportunity to do that. And the other thing that I think underlies all of it is learning to ask for and accept help. When we find ourselves moving in a path we don't want to be moving down, to ask others if they can help us. I was fortunate to participate in an apprenticeship program in the Unicore factory, which is the apprenticeship is by the Department of Labor. And I talked to men and women about there's these apprenticeships that occur in the prisons that are available throughout the prisons, and they can be continued upon release. They can be completed before release, or you can start them upon release. But these outside, they're paid apprenticeships, and a paid apprenticeship means that I can earn a paycheck while I'm learning a skill, and then the American Job Centers, which is a part of the Department of Labor, will place me into a meaningful job where I have a living wage and have benefits and other things. So it's important, I think, that people realize that these opportunities are there because they're not advertised, they're not broadcasted, they're not easy to get involved in, but they're certainly beneficial. And then in 2020, there was an education reform package that was passed and signed into law, and that was as part of this package, it was a large package, but as part of it, they reinstated Pell Grants for the incarcerated population. They eliminated Pell Grants going back to, 1986 or something, but they're now available for those that are incarcerated. And that means that people can take classes while they're away. They can work on different programs. And I've been blessed that I've been doing some work with some colleges and helping them develop ideas and curriculum, because my belief is that a bachelor's degree, while it's a wonderful thing, please don't let me understate that at all, but for somebody who's incarcerated, it's a really heavy lift to have 4 years of classes. That's at a full-time pace, where a semester while you're incarcerated might be 2 classes at a time. But what's really valuable are these certificate programs that are issued by colleges and universities. For example, I'm proud to have worked with a group at a school in Indiana that they offer a logistics and supply chain certificate. It's 6 classes, but upon graduation, you've got a certificate issued by an accredited university. And by the way, if you go back for your bachelor's degree, those 6 classes count toward your degree. But you can take that certificate in logistics and you could walk into, frankly, any Amazon or other such company in this country and get hired. And so, because that's an industry known to be friendly to offering second chances for people that have been incarcerated. And so if I'm going to be away and I can get education, and all I have to invest in that education is my time, and I can walk out, I can show my kids while I'm away, dad's taking college classes, and then I can walk out and get a meaningful job, that it does a great deal to help us improve the feeling of hopelessness and recreate our self-esteem, both between the apprenticeship and the education piece. They tell us that those that take education courses while they're away, the recidivism rate falls by 43%. Those that actually complete an apprenticeship, the recidivism rate falls by about 90%. So while these are not the answers, they're a part of a bigger puzzle, I think. And the part of the bigger puzzle is to say that I've got other things in my jigsaw puzzle. I have some substance abuse issues or whatever it might be, but it all, in my mind at least, it kind of links together. If I feel that there's hope upon my release that I can live a somewhat normal life, then it inspires me, it motivates me to be involved in, for example, the drug program in prison is voluntary. So yes, I want to be involved in that. I want to learn why that happened. I want to try to learn some of these behaviors that I can avoid and things I can do so that I don't go back down that path. And the other thing I want to point out is that the unintended but positive consequence of offering these type of certificate programs through colleges is that there are people that will be then motivated to get their GED. I used to work, as I've said now 3 times, in the education building, but I walked down the hallway and in the GED classrooms, there were 3 groups of people. There was the ones in the front, maybe 3 or 4 that are paying attention. Then there's a group in this corner that are playing cards. And then there's a group over in this corner, there's 4 or 5 guys with their head on the table sleeping. And the conversation would always go to, a GED is not going to do me any good. I can get the same job without a GED than I can get with one. But if the GED is a means to that next step, the next step being a certificate from a college in something I'm interested in, then there's a reason for me to be involved in the classroom. There's a reason for me to work with the tutors, which are fellow inmates that'll help me through math or English or whatever my challenges might lie. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, but I do want to talk about my career and how it came to be. I got my first job, I arranged it in a prison visiting room. One thing that happens as a byproduct of being incarcerated is that I'll talk to anybody, anywhere about anything. I can't be embarrassed. If somebody rejects me, it's not going to bother me. So I met a guy who went to the same high school I did, and I had about a year to go, and we talked, and he said, what are you going to do when you get out? And I told him, I don't know. I've been teaching classes and I've been going out in the community. I got these business guys that tell me I should be doing training inside of companies. So he said, send me something, send me what you're working on, which is the wrong thing to tell a person who's locked up. So I sent him a packet of stuff about this thick, and I had about 3 months left, and he called my wife and said, I want to go visit Augie. And so he showed up at the prison visiting room, and he said, before we even sat down, he said, I want you to know I want to hire you. When you come to Chicago, you have a job. And that was like the weight of the world coming off my shoulders, because I sat in doubt all the time, who's going to give me that chance. But anyway, I went to work for him, and I was the director of training, and he had an executive search and staffing firm. And I was working with someone's corporate clients, and then he said, my dad wants to have lunch with you, wants to meet you. So it ends up his father was a pretty, he was certainly a very generous man. He created a foundation called the CARE program and helped the disenfranchised with employment, not just people who were locked up, but he helped people to find jobs. It's an organization now that's done it for thousands of people over the last 30 years. Anyway, the father said to me, Augie, I want to help you. Can I help you? And I told Mr. Owens I'd be honored. And he introduced me by email to the Cook County Sheriff, Tom Dart, who I've never met in person, but Cook County is the largest single site jail in the world. And I was invited 4 days later. I'm sitting at 26 in California inside the jail all surrounded by double razor wire. At this point, I've only been out 3 months. And I met with a group of, there were like 18 officers in the room. And they wanted me to bring with some of the material that I had been instructing while I was away. And so I did. And before the meeting ended, the woman in charge, Dr. Gubser, said, oh, we don't have anything like this. Will you help us out? Can I get you to come in here and start to teach this to our detainees? And so I wasn't sure how I'd feel about that, going behind double razor wire every week. But at the end of the day, I knew that's what I wanted to do, and I did. And I started going in there, and it took off. It became my career. And I would have never thought that. But now I go into jails and prisons and halfway houses and recovery centers. I work with juvenile groups. We just started working with veterans and veterans that have been incarcerated. And we do life skill and employment readiness and reentry programs. I now work with 10 presenters. All of us have lived experience. An old cellmate of mine came down and translated everything into Spanish. So now we offer in English and Spanish, and we put everything together so it's available through tablets inside jails and prisons. It can be streamed in. So we're actually able to get this content now into thousands of people, and it's accompanied by workbooks and workshops and what have you. So this is beyond my comprehension how this has happened so quickly, but it does tell me that there is demand for this stuff and that our material is well received, because I think it comes from, I know from my perspective, it comes from my heart. This is stuff that will help people to prepare for and re-enter. And then the other part that we provide is we provide post-release support. So Sheriff Hain and it's been a great relationship for me, but I get calls from his guys all the time that get out, and they say, you remember me? I was in your class in 2018. I just got out of the Illinois system. Can you help me find a job, or can you help me with housing, or whatever it might be? And that's what we do, is we try to refer and help people to move on to that next path. So finally, I'll say that I go around and I speak with employers. I did it a lot more before COVID, but I would be invited in the chambers of commerce and speak with 25, 50 employers at a time and talk about the value of hiring people, providing second chances. And then I'm able to develop these networks where we can refer people for employment. And the story that I would tell, and that I do tell, is when I first got to the halfway house, and then I went and got my driver's license. I hadn't driven in many years. And anyway, I was fortunate to be able to use a car to go to work every morning. And as I would go down the entrance ramp onto the Eisenhower Expressway in Chicago, it was really a challenge for me. In fact, it was like white knuckle. I had driven in my life before I got locked up probably 1 million miles, but when you're locked up, you don't see many things moving at 70 miles an hour. So merging into traffic was a real challenge for me. And I say that, once I got into traffic, I drove just like everybody else. But getting down that entry ramp to get into traffic was where my challenge was. And I say that I just need somebody to be just a little bit patient with me. Somebody's just a little patient with me and let me get in. I'll be just like everybody else. And that's a story that I bring to employers. And that's also a story that I share with the populations we work, is to say, we're not looking for mountains to be moved. Just look for that one opportunity where somebody will be a little bit patient with you, to listen to you and what you have to say and where your heart is and where you want to be. So I conclude by saying that, it is possible to do productive time. And it's possible to develop good habits and to learn to think differently while we're locked up. And it's possible to learn skills and take advantage of opportunities in education and in trades. It's possible to become a success story, and it's possible to walk away from jail or prison and not return, but it begins in jail. So I thank you very much, and I am glad to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Augie, thank you so much. I'll tell everyone at this point in Illinois, when he concluded, he had a very large standing ovation from everybody in the room. And I know it's hard for us to replicate that in Zoom, but I'm sure everybody is virtually sending you the appreciation that goes is congruent with a standing ovation, right, everybody? So really appreciate you guys adding your comments in the chat that Augie can see. We have a couple of minutes. If anyone has a question or comment that you preferably come off mute to share verbally, if you'd like to do that. Betty, I'm seeing lots of comments of appreciation and gratitude in the chat. Also here, when we pivot in a moment, Augie, I would love for you to take a look at what Danny Contreras put in the chat, his experience. And Danny, wow, I work with you in Santa Cruz and I had no idea. So thank you so much for sharing that, and definitely want to follow up with you and think about how we might be able to share, your message and story with this group as well. So Augie, second time you've had the guts to share your personal story, which I know can't be easy. Thank you so much. I know we were all really, really inspired and informed by your life experience and how you've moved through this situation with grace and landed in a place where you're really giving back to others and to society, and you're a role model in that regard. And I know we'll continue to hear your words as we go about this work and think about, are we doing everything we can do to help people get that second opportunity? So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everybody that was in this, and for the nice comments. I will say that I will be at the American Jail Association convention in Long Beach in May. So if anybody that's in the room or in this group is going to be at that thing, please stop by the second opportunity booth so we can say hello and shake hands. I would appreciate that.
That'd be great. And on that note, I assume it's okay for us to put your email in the chat and to share that. We can put it in the deck before we send it out, and you're okay with folks reaching out to you directly via your email?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So there it is in the chat, you guys. So again, thank you, Augie.